Over the months leading up to Donald Trump's second term as president, Canadian politicians were consumed by one question: what to do if Trump imposed a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods? Even the most optimistic experts said the fallout would be disastrous, perhaps as bad as the Great Depression for Canadians and many Americans as well. But citizens and pundits were comforted by one thought: America needs Canadian oil more than Canada needs just about anything from the US. Certainly the tariffs couldn't go through as long as the threat of cutting off oil was on the table. But then, just before Trump took office, the premiers of Canada met with the Prime Minister to make a plan and issue a joint statement. The only person who didn't sign the statement was Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, who joined the meeting via video call from Panama. The reason? She couldn't support the country's plan as long as a potential tariff or export ban on Albertan oil was on the table. People across Canada, even in conservative oil-loving Alberta, called her a traitor, while her base said she was being proactive and looking out for Albertan interests. Danielle Smith's decision to snub Team Canada carries serious potential consequences for the whole country. But calling her a traitor misses the mark, because Smith doesn't and has never cared about Canada. Her allegiance is to Albertans, and specifically the ones who helped elevate her from a media pundit with a failed political career to the premier of the province. Danielle Smith's road to becoming premier is likely one of the oddest you've heard. It's a story of surprising victories followed by stunning failures over and over. In her early days, Smith was enamored with communism before her conservative parents steered her away. But for a long time, she was a moderate. Her mentors in university introduced her to a more libertarian viewpoint, favoring free market capitalism, and she stuck to it. Smith attended the University of Calgary in the 80s, as Alberta separatism was experiencing a surge, following Pierre Elliott Trudeau's national energy program that took some of Alberta's oil and gas profits into federal coffers. Some of her professors wrote a letter called the Firewall Letter, urging the premier to remove the RCMP, CPP, and CRA from the province and replace them with their own provincial services. This environment planted the seeds of Smith's political ideology, something that would bear fruit decades later. Smith's first political position was as a trustee on the Calgary Board of Education. To make a long story short, she was so difficult to work with and disruptive that the Minister of Education fired the entire board since it was no longer functioning. Smith went on to write columns for the Calgary Herald, where she wrote typical conservative things like criticisms of Jean Chrétien, supporting privatization, and also more out-there viewpoints, especially for the time, like claiming that cigarettes could reduce the risk of disease. Her editor said that her columns often sounded like mouthpieces for her source, an important characteristic of Smith to remember for later. In 2009, Smith returned to politics amongst another period of political change in Alberta. The Progressive Conservatives, who had run the country since the 70s, had made a number of controversial policy choices, including moving to the center on a variety of social issues, which made room for the farther-right Wildrose Party to gain some traction. The leader of the Wildrose Party stepped down and courted Smith, who he knew from her columns, to lead the party. Smith ran as a unifier, someone who strongly believed in fiscal conservatism and libertarianism, but also supported gay marriage and a woman's right to choose. She won the leadership bid with 3/4 of the vote. Danielle Smith changed the Wildrose Party from a right-wing fringe party to the favorites in the 2012 election, promising to run a balanced budget, scrap carbon capture programs, and implement elements of that letter her professors had written back in the 80s, like instituting a provincial pension plan. She was charismatic and friendly. She remembered people she'd seen once at a rally weeks ago. People liked her and her vision, and the Wildrose Party was projected to win, and win big. But shortly before the election, a candidate from the party claimed he had an advantage because he was white. Another candidate said that gay people would suffer the rest of eternity in a lake of fire. Smith's response on both comments was light. She defended their freedom of speech. But for Albertans, it was like the veil was lifted. The Wildrose Party was not a grassroots conservative movement, but a fringe party after all. Smith lost the election and formed the official opposition. 2 years later, Smith and the moderate MLAs from the Wildrose Party crossed the floor and joined the ruling Progressive Conservatives. It was the first time a Canadian opposition leader had ever joined a sitting government. Her supporters felt betrayed. Smith and all of the MLAs who crossed the floor lost their seat in the next election. Beyond that, the controversy spread the vote between the PCs and the Wildrose Party. That, coupled with a strong NDP leader, resulted in a stunning NDP majority, the first break in Conservative rule in Alberta in decades. Smith's leadership bid and political career were over, it would seem. But Smith would dive back into media, and just as with the Wildrose Party, her penchant for accepting and amplifying the views of whoever she talked to would lead to another political opportunity. Smith started a radio show in Calgary, welcoming a number of fringe political guests, but her real turn happened during COVID. Smith consistently gave airtime to anti-vaccine advocates, promoted non-mainstream cures, and decried mask mandates. In 2022, she supported a protest of anti-vaxxers, free speech activists, and Christian fundamentalists who had gathered to protest vaccine mandates. In that group was a 34-year-old activist named David Parker, the son of a pastor from a small town in Alberta, and an ex-advisor for Smith during her time with the Wildrose Party. The Progressive Conservatives and Wildrose Party had merged, creating the United Conservative Party, or UCP. It was, however, anything but united. The traditional PCs and alt-right Wildrosians clashed, and COVID only made it worse. Premier Jason Kenney was becoming increasingly unpopular, which opened the door for Smith and David Parker. Parker had formed an organization called Take Back Alberta. TBA became devoted to separatism, pro-privatization movements, religious fundamentalism, and anti-trans views. Parker decided to use TBA to try and take over the UCP from the inside. He urged his supporters to buy party memberships so they could back TBA-aligned candidates for the board. If they could get enough representation, they could remove Kenney at the next leadership review and in his place put Parker's friend and old boss, Danielle Smith. Smith was the perfect candidate for a number of reasons. First, on her own, she aligned with many of their views. But beyond that, we can see throughout Smith's life that she's very suggestible. Whether it be her experience at university, her time in media, her run in the Wildrose Party, or her time as an oil lobbyist, which we'll get to in a minute, Smith adopts the views of the people around her. For an organization like Take Back Alberta that wants to run from the shadows, a suggestible leader who owes them her place in government is a powerful piece on the chessboard. In May of 2022, Jason Kenney barely won his leadership review, but said that the support was not sufficient to give him a new mandate, and announced his resignation. Smith ran for the position. On her campaign, Parker went with her, helping her connect with his fringe supporters. Smith campaigned on the Alberta Sovereignty Act, a bill that would allow the Alberta government to rewrite provincial laws and ignore federal mandates, allowing Alberta to become a sort of nation within a nation. TBA supporters loved it. About 900 of them showed up at the UCP's annual general meeting. With the backing of TBA, Smith narrowly defeated her opponent to become the new leader of the UCP, and as a result, Premier.
Tonight marks the beginning of a new chapter in the Alberta story. It is time for Alberta to take its place as a senior partner in building a strong and unified Canada.
The Alberta Sovereignty Act passed, although a watered-down version, but it allows Alberta to ignore federal laws if it deems them unconstitutional or harmful to Alberta. There are legitimate questions around whether this act actually does anything, or if it's simply an incredibly effective political stunt. Alberta has evoked the act twice, both times to push back against the federal government on issues related to energy. Both times, the act didn't technically do anything, because the federal requirements were still in draft form. Instead, it was used as a powerful negotiating tactic to show how serious Alberta is and to rally anti-federalist sentiments. If the Sovereignty Act is officially used to ignore a federal mandate that's been signed into law, it would most likely trigger a constitutional challenge, and the act could very likely be struck down. If that were to happen, it would likely trigger even more fervor among Albertan separatists, and an escalation of some of the farther right politics in the province. And while that may seem perfectly aligned with Smith's political goals, it could be disastrous for her. While TBA helped her win, the victory was slim. If Smith veers too far to the right, like fully embracing an aggressive separatist movement, she risks losing the support of moderate conservatives. If she moves too far to the middle, Well, Parker has explicitly said he would use the same tactics against Smith that he used on Kenney. And while full-on separatism may not be a popular sentiment across all conservatives in Alberta, most conservatives agree they want less federal control in the province. And that may hold the key to Smith's actions at that Team Canada meeting in January 2024. Much of Smith's time as Premier has been spent trying to stick it to Justin Trudeau, largely in a way that supports some of her other friends, the oil and gas industry. Smith has said that Alberta will not meet the federal emissions targets or new clean energy investments. In 2023, the UCP put a 7-month moratorium on new renewable energy investments, despite it having recently brought over $5 billion of investment into the province and being a growing industry, in part because building new renewables was what the federal government wanted them to do. Smith has become the poster child of a rising sentiment of anti-federalism across the country. And so, when Smith refused to sign the joint statement on Canada's response to Trump's potential tariffs, in a way it was simply an extension of what she's always done, and has to do: reject what Ottawa tells her, especially when it may negatively impact Alberta. After all, signing the agreement would draw the ire of the alt-right separatists like TBA and more centrist conservatives who value oil and gas. The difference is that Saskatchewan, Quebec, and Ontario, the other 3 provinces that have heavily expressed anti-federalism, did sign the statement. They acknowledged that despite the potential detriment to their province, the country had to come first. But as many have pointed out, the comparison of Ontario's auto industry, which has been specifically targeted by Trump, and Quebec's energy exports to Alberta's oil industry is like apples and oranges. In 2023, Canada exported $51 billion worth of vehicles, 93% of which went to the US. That same year, Alberta exported $122 billion in crude oil to the United States. That's not even their only oil export. So on the surface, isn't Danielle Smith correct to say that she has to protect the interest of oil and gas because of its significant impact on her province's economy? Well, it's more complicated, and part of what makes it so complicated is that Smith clearly has a conflict of interest. Between the time that Smith was a media pundit and when she became premier, she was a lobbyist as the president of the Alberta Enterprise Group. She pitched a program to the energy minister called R-Star. R-Star simply was a program that would give rebates to oil and gas companies to clean up their abandoned wells. When Smith was elected, one of her first actions was to implement a 3-year pilot program called the Site Liability Incentive Program, a different name but the same program as R-Star. Whether or not R-Star is a good idea or not is the topic for another video. There are some valid points for why Alberta would want such a program. But there is a clear winner, and surprise, it's oil companies. Smith's original letter, when she was a lobbyist, recommended for $20 billion in credits for oil companies to clean up tens of thousands of abandoned wells. But under Alberta law, companies are already required to clean up their wells at their own cost. Approval of new wells is supposed to take into account whether or not a company has cleaned up their old ones. But this is poorly enforced. Companies often go bankrupt, and the province's regulator can't afford to clean up the wells on their own. So theoretically, this program is designed to help small oil companies that have to choose between cleaning up an old well or going bankrupt. But an analysis by Scotiabank found it expects the biggest winner would be CNRL, the largest oil producer in the country, followed by giants Cenovus and Paramount Resources. Cenovus made $6.5 billion in 2021. In Danielle Smith's leadership campaign, she quickly raised $1.3 million, the most out of the 10 candidates. We don't know where those donations came from because she won't disclose them, and can only speculate on whether or not oil and gas execs had a hand in that. David Parker of Take Back Alberta has been fined for refusing to release his donor records. Regardless, her history as an oil lobbyist makes it difficult to trust that Smith can be impartial on legislation related to the industry. And that brings us to our final question. In the case of potential tariffs, should Canada push for oil and gas to be exempt? It's very difficult to get a definitive answer to that question. On the one hand, oil is Canada's largest export in terms of money, and it's not close. Cutting off oil exports would be devastating to the country and the province of Alberta. But by protecting oil, and only oil, the effects on Canada and Alberta itself could be more severe. To understand that, we need to understand why the United States imports so much Canadian oil. In the 90s, there were fears that America's oil reserves were drying up. To avoid a shortage, the US looked to Venezuela, who became a crucial oil trading partner. Venezuela's oil is a heavier, bitumen-rich crude oil. It's more difficult and costly to process and requires specific facilities. But as a result, it's also cheaper to buy. The vast majority of America's refineries invested significantly in the facilities required to process this heavier oil. Over the next decade, political upheavals in Venezuela made trade difficult, but luckily just as that was happening, the Albertan oil sands were kicking off in a big way. Why ship oil all the way from Venezuela when your neighbor upstairs has it in spades? Canada and the US invested billions of dollars into pipelines, allowing Canadian oil to quickly and cheaply reach the Midwest and other landlocked parts of the country. Interestingly, new technological advances meant that a number of oil fields in the US that were thought barren were in fact still highly productive. But those oil patches produced a lighter, sometimes called sweeter oil, that could not be processed in the same facilities as the heavier crude. In addition, even if the US did have the facilities to process their own oil, they lacked the pipeline infrastructure to transport it across the country. So in fact, America produces a lot of oil, more than they need, but they export almost all of it because they're simply not set up to use the oil they harvest, which is why the US needs Canadian oil. Even if they could get more oil from Venezuela, whose reserves are drying up, or Russia, who's still under sanctions, getting that oil to US shores and then transporting it across the country would be extremely costly and require heavy infrastructure investment. And finally, of all the costs in this world, the one that has been shown to be close to, if not the most politically powerful, is the price of gas at the pump. Prolonged tariffs that raise the price of American gas promises to have severe political consequences for a Republican government with a slim majority in the House and Senate, and midterms only 2 short years away. All of that to say, Canadian oil is by far the most powerful bargaining chip at the table, and also not Alberta's only significant export. In fact, in 2023, Albertan oil and mineral exports to the US fell by 18%, while machinery, agriculture, apparel, and other industries rose by double-digit percentages. Obviously, their monetary impact is not the same, but many Albertans are affected by the success of those industries as well. If Canada and Alberta were to get an exemption from oil tariffs, it would likely prolong the tariffs on other Canadian goods. If the United States doesn't feel the pain of having their oil cut off, or a drastic increase in gas prices, they may lack the political will to stop tariffs that affect other industries that will certainly hurt Canadians and Albertans. But in the end, despite being the only premier not to sign the joint statement, despite the negative reactions of other premiers, Canadians, and some Albertans, Danielle Smith's stance is exactly what she has to do. In November 2024, Smith won a leadership review with over 91% of the vote. Her approval rating has stayed around 45% the entire time she's been in office, which at times has made her one of the most popular and most unpopular premiers in the country. For all of the legitimate criticisms of Smith, how she has governed has been a masterclass in balancing on the edge of a knife, managing to keep traditional conservatives happy while living up to the promises she made to some of the province's farther right-wing voters. Distancing herself from the other premiers is simply a continuation of the anti-federalist sentiment she helped popularize and campaigned on. The calls of traitor may be legitimate in the context of how her actions could affect all Canadians. But Smith, frankly, doesn't seem to care about all Canadians. Her priorities are to hold on to the position of power that she's pursued her whole career by catering to the people that put her there. The question that will likely be answered for all of us if the rest of Trump's presidency is as tumultuous as the weeks leading up to it is, can Canada thrive as a divided nation where provinces look out for their own interests?